Hey there, it's Dan and you're watching The Salty Sea. Today, I'm here to dive into one of my favorite Warhammer topics that I never touch on, lore discourse. Don't be afraid, folks. The Warcry Grand Alliance books got the unusual privilege of the first look at a whole line of Slaanesh forces that normally would have come through a preview show or an AOS big box, and that's exciting. So I'm going to get into what they mean sort of for the Warhammer setting as a whole. Now, this is a topic that can ruffle feathers and upset folks, so try to come in with an open mind. And hey, if you're a keep your politics out of my war game type of dude, feel free to skip. I'm going to be back with plenty of tactical Warcry videos, and even a bit of narrative campaign content. But if you like the esoterica of our game, come on a journey with me. After all, existence itself is political. No one can avoid it forever. I'm also going to get into issues of LGBTQ+ representation and female representation. I want to acknowledge here that as a cishet man, I'm not the best mouthpiece for some of the themes I need to touch on to really get to the bottom of what's going on with Slaanesh. Unfortunately, in such a white guy-dominated community, someone has to start these conversations, or they just won't happen. I also use the Q word in relation to social theory later in the video, knowing that it's a divisive word coming out of the mouth of someone like me. I hope that's okay, and I promise I'm doing it in good faith. I'll be grounding that part of the discussion in the words of folks who are closer to the issues than I am. So let's start by just mentioning a bunch of new previews. Us Warcraft fans got to see stats for a plethora of upcoming Slaanesh models, which is really exciting, and it forced GW's hand to toss out some early previews for their model line. By and large, I think the models look incredible, and I'm going to deep dive them later in the video. But before I do that, I want to muse on how Slaanesh is the most complicated Chaos God for GW. And I think they know this, that executing on Slaanesh is tough. There's a reason why they started AOS with Slaanesh in jail and out of the setting. So, what is Slaanesh? Who is Slaanesh? Well, at the basic level, Slaanesh is the Chaos God of Excess, the Dark Prince of Pleasure, she who thirsts, depending on who's saying it in the lore. The backbone of the Warhammer universe is the metaphysical idea that humanity is beset by a four-pronged force known as chaos. That's different from evil, or at least it was at first. Some of the distinction has been lost over time, but these forces are sort of dark mirrors of our own selves. The four Chaos Gods represent the aspects of civilization's sort of self-made destruction. So you have Khorne, the Chaos God of bloodshed and rage, Tzeentch, the Chaos God of change, and Nurgle, the Chaos God of decay, or sort of the circle of life gone awry. Finally, we get Slaanesh, the Chaos God of excess. What Slaanesh is and how Slaanesh has been represented are sort of different. So let's establish what the surface lore tells us Slaanesh is. Excess. Almost anything can be healthy and positive in moderation, so Slaanesh is about taking good things too far, and it can come in a couple ways. Let's say we divide all human activity, everything you do, into a spectrum of work or leisure, or work or play. Play, in excess, is hedonism, and oh boy, does Slaanesh have you covered. Everyone deserves to have a good time, but Slaanesh followers gleefully push the boundaries of pleasure, pain, and sensation into, quote, disgusting, hedonistic revelry. Now, work in excess is obsession, and Slaanesh loves that too. If self-improvement and dedication are human virtues, then the dark mirror of those impulses is to toss moderation out the window and obsess about your craft to the exclusion of all other things in life. So now that we've covered sort of what Slaanesh is doing, let me just talk about my history with the faction. This is where I am going to admit that I'm rather young to the hobby. I painted my fair share of Space Wolves when I was a kid, but as far as getting back into it, I started painting Seraphon in the fall of 2017. Because I was looking for a second game to play while Magic the Gathering was going through a down period that didn't inspire me. Let's also be real, Total War Warhammer was a big time factor in getting me to leap over the edge, and probably the main reason I chose Seraphon over Sylvaneth, who I've grown to love the most since then. Because the only way to collect things quickly when you start out using the GW value packs, I grabbed a bunch of Stormcast in summer 2018, but found myself looking around and wishing I had bad guys or villains to set my 2-order forces against. That's when, late 2018, the Wrath and Rapture box dropped. This was GW's Khorne versus Slaanesh value box, and honestly I might have dropped Warhams eventually if I hadn't found this box. It was perfect. It presented 2 supposedly villain factions that in turn hated each other. Demonettes and Bloodletters contrast each other beautifully, and then Fiends and Seekers versus Blood Crushers and Fleshhounds. They were all just perfect mirrors of each other in that box. So I've been painting and playing Slaanesh for 2 years now. Wow, that's not that long, but the fugue state of 2020 pandemic makes it feel like I've been invested in Slaanesh since the dawn of time. And in that time, I've grown to love the faction to the point where I don't even really consider them villains now. So let me just get into how, as I've sunk more into Slaanesh's milieu, I found my love of the faction to be pretty complicated. First, let's talk about if there even is a Slaanesh problem. What do I mean? Why does the God of Excess have to be complicated? Why can't we just relax and say, hey, it's just a game? I don't mean why is excess a problem at face value, though we might touch on that. I mean, why is the existence of Slaanesh a problem for the 2 Warhammer universes? Is it even one? So we'll start with the sex part. I know, teehee, but sex is the elephant in the room when talking Slaanesh, so let's get it out in the open right away. Honestly, I think the community sort of willfully misinterprets GW's vision for Slaanesh, choosing to focus on the sex when GW doesn't always ask them to. There's plenty of places to blame here. Blame the patriarchy. Blame the fact that Warhammer is a dad game but marketed to teen boys. Blame the simple fact that some people have dirty minds, and that's okay. The fact is, though, I just explained that Slaanesh is a many-layered parfait of temptation and horror, and yet the community just says, yeah, but Slaanesh is horny. Yes, Slaanesh is horny. Half of Slaanesh's domain is hedonism, and sex is a subsection of pleasure. That's okay. But Nurgle's horny too. In fact, I'd say Nurgle is even hornier than Slaanesh. How do you think he calls himself a life god? But you don't see people sexualizing the grandfather, now do you? Listen, I don't know if this is even a Slaanesh problem. Over-sexualizing the other is sort of a society problem. And even if it weren't for just that, some people are just horny and that's life. We don't need to pretend it doesn't exist. So if I think sex in Warhammer is ultimately somewhat okay, why bring it up? Well, sexualizing Slaanesh is a more complicated topic because Slaanesh is unique in the Warhammer universe. Slaanesh is explicitly gender non-conforming, and whether they're the only such character, they're by far the most important LGBTQ+ character in Warhammer lore. So let's get to the part where, people call Slaanesh degenerate, etc. Because it's this uniqueness and othering that lets every other part of Slaanesh become a problem. This is the part where other people have said it better than I can. So I'm linking 2 articles down below for the curious among you. One is by Dorian and Dawes, and one is by Hipsterhammer. Dawes does an awesome job getting down to the core of the Slaanesh degeneracy problem, while writing in an article about the demonization of female sexuality and queerness in 40K. So I'm just going to quote for a second. Stories regarding Slaanesh and her cult typically involve beautiful women seducing faithful Imperial Guards or Space Marines into their beds, making them vulnerable to demonic possession. Sometimes her cultists are portrayed as being androgynous, lithe young men trapping otherwise straight and masculine men into an act of queerness. It's gay panic for space operas. Then they go on to describe an actual incident of a public figure using Slaanesh as a tool to make personal attacks online against another public figure. That's pretty rough, and the fact that 40K allows that, or encourages it by implication, is a problem. So they go on to write, queerness is portrayed as an actual threat to the universe. Women in control of their sexuality are shown as demonic predators. Often in discussions about the Imperium's cartoonish fascism, one of the defenses of their actions is that the universe is so horrifying that fascism becomes justified. By that extent, queerness justifies fascism in this universe. Now, I personally think these quotes are a bit uncharitable to what GW is trying to go for with Slaanesh, and I'll explain that a bit in the Fixing Slaanesh section. But the core of Dorian's point is sort of inescapable, and the canon storyline doesn't do much to refute it. The presence and the positioning of Slaanesh in the lore over the years creates a temptation to call real-life examples of Slaanesh-y things degenerate. I'm dancing around it, so let's just make the point plain. GW only has one queer-coded faction in the setting, and they've made them the Lust faction, and they've called them evil. The fact that the faction also happens to be the only Chaos faction with a lot of female followers isn't a coincidence, and is also a problem. Now, before you say, "Sir, this is a Wendy's," or "These releases are for AOS and Warcry," that's totally different. I just want to note that, yes, the two settings are a bit different, and the Slaanesh problem exists differently in both. I'll continue to expand on this, but for now, in AOS, the good guys aren't fascists. Sigmar has done some terrible things, but they were generally the actions of a well-meaning dude who's in over his head. AOS doesn't make chaos and, by 1/4 extension, queerness the justification for fascism, which, let me be clear, is the worst evil in living human memory. In fact, Warcry, my favorite GW game, makes it clear that in the fantasy setting, a world ruled by chaos is bad, but at least functional. Life goes on. But on the flip side, in AOS, you can't as easily shrug and say, well, the good guys are bad too, so it's all satire, dude. The satire defense of 40K is one of my pet peeves, but better left for another video. For now, let's just say that AOS can't even fall back on that, because AOS is less satirical. So how do you fix this Slaanesh problem as I've outlined it here? Well, one possibility is you could just kill off Slaanesh. Listen, Slaanesh itself, as a character, not as the metaphysical concept that I mentioned before, as a character, it's just a bad avatar for what the model range and the expressed concept of a god of excess is trying to communicate. The Hipsterhammer piece that I've linked has a great explanation, but here's my own version of what Slaanesh is really supposed to be at its core. There is a chaotic urge inside you. It is an intrinsic part of you, and there's nothing you can do to escape it. Your flesh is a sensational prison for your mind, and even if it weren't, your mind would still strive to always seek the extremes, the interest. Experience desensitizes you to experience, and only through excess can you ever truly feel. On a related note, the most beautifully compelling and wrong quote on happiness in life that I've ever read comes from F. Scott Fitzgerald, through the mouth of a depressed character facing down middle age. Youth is like having a big plate of candy. Sentimentalists think they want to be in the pure, simple state they were in before they ate the candy. They don't. They just want the fun of eating it all over again. The matron doesn't want to repeat her girlhood. She wants to repeat her honeymoon. I don't want to repeat my innocence. I want the pleasure of losing it again. Listen, Slaanesh preys on the existential dread of someone who truly believes this quote. Slaanesh says, hey, I know where you can get some more candy. You know you've had enough candy, that more would be bad for you. But don't you just want a taste? That's kind of scary, isn't it? Not in a, oh my god, maybe there's a monster under my bed kind of way, but in a, oh my god, maybe the monster is my own heart kind of way. Maybe the essence of my very own being, the innocent child inside me, is what's betraying me to evil. Now, all that concepting is Slaanesh theory, and it makes a really interesting god. So, what does eating elves and burning down civilization really have to do with any of that? It doesn't, right? When I said Dorian's Slaanesh critique was uncharitable, I meant that GW's stated metaphysical domain of Slaanesh from all their intro materials is meant to contain far more universal horrors than just gay panic. But to be fair, GW hasn't executed very well on that. Slaanesh's actions in both fantasy and 40k don't really align with what we're told is the horror of Slaanesh. Killing off the character just takes this botched execution and just tosses it out. We missed the boat. We fucked it up. There's no going back. Good riddance. Wash our whole hands of the whole damn mess. The problem with that is the Slaanesh model range exists, and people bought it thinking they could play with it. What are they, some damn Bretonnians? There's also the fact, and I don't know exactly how to treat this in the discussion, but when the newest Slaanesh stuff got previewed on Christmas, one person reacted with a rainbow graphic saying, "Great day to be gay," and got several likes. So regardless of how poorly GW executed Slaanesh in the past, it's out there and there's people who see themselves in it. So getting rid of it does as much harm as good. Now, just to note, just because some people love the faction doesn't erase the problematic aspects of it. There are also a ton of people who have looked at it and felt offended. Neither reaction is going to be valued over the other here. Just pointing out that both are happening. A second fix is to just make Slaanesh not evil anymore. Realign them out of the Chaos Pantheon or into a different part of it. Listen, nothing Slaanesh actually wants for their followers is a bad thing. Let's look at the Fitzgerald Candy example. I've read 2 of his novels, and one thing really jumps off the page with Fitzgerald. For all his talent, something F. Scott never understood and unfortunately died before he ever had a chance to discover is that eating candy doesn't have to stop when you finish the jar. You can make more candy, and doing so doesn't make you degenerate. You can travel the world, you can cook new dishes, you can meet new people and engage with them and let them fill your life with newness and joy and beauty. And yes, sex is a part of that, but it isn't everything. And you can do all that without needing to steal someone else's candy or even feel like you're cheating. Sigvald and Fulgrim might be bad guys, but the fact that they got so good at sword fighting isn't what's bad about them. So why is Slaanesh evil in the lore? Well, this is where we can get a little hot takey if we want to, but the fact is, I think Slaanesh is only a chaos god because it was first written for a setting where militaristic traditionalism was everything. And Slaanesh was written by people who maybe couldn't totally grasp the idea of non-traditional folks enjoying their lives without feeling ashamed of themselves. Gay? Shameful. Trans? Shameful. Come from a culture where sensuality isn't a sin? Shameful. Are you a straight white male like me, but for some reason you say things like ally and believe in free love? Well, that's shameful too. Slaanesh first appeared in 1988, 4 years after Prince released Purple Rain, with his love symbol emblazoned proudly on a motorcycle, and 6 years after he combined the male and female symbols in his art for the first time. Slaanesh's aesthetic borrows heavily from Prince's. The Slaanesh symbol is a reworked version of the symbol Prince changed his name to for a while, and the purple, gender-rejecting vibe belonged to Prince far before GW started using it. So as Slaanesh developed in the late 80s and 90s, it became GW's sort of commentary on cultural movements generally, even as they set most of their setting in sort of a British heavy metal vibe. Classically masculine Imperium folks get made fun of in Slaanesh stories, but the free love countercultural folks also get dismissed as monstrous demons. 80s GW writers knew enough to lampoon the folks getting too upset by beatniks and hippies, and I truly commend them for that. But they also couldn't see quite far enough to stick the knife in the whole way, and really troll them by just making Slaanesh a good gal. Not a member of the Imperium, by the way. I don't think Slaanesh would ever fit there, and the Imperium aren't good. Just an unaligned force out there in the rest of the world the same way, half the Xenos armies are. Taking Slaanesh out of the Chaos Pantheon and turning it into another unaligned faction solves the problem of calling non-traditional sexuality a sin in world. Because if it's no longer a foe, then maybe it can be a friend? While a step forward, it's still really othering if only one faction has these elements, and if that one faction is being sexualized by the community. So we get to our third fix, which is to make non-evil factions that are like Slaanesh or add more representation into other parts of the game. Listen, with female representation, I'm not the first person to comment on how we need more of it in GW's universes. And I know it upsets a lot of people for some reason when people say it. But listen, Slaanesh is one of very few factions with, quote, curvy models, and even occasional female members. The more you have, the less weight Slaanesh is lifting to represent women in 40k and AOS. But if Slaanesh is one of very few female-inclusive factions, it's even lonelier when you look at LGBTQ+ representation in Warhammer. You have Slaanesh and Yenneed, and that's it. That's unfortunate, I think. Now, this is part of why Slaanesh is less of a problem in AOS than it is in 40k. Variety is endorsed a little more in AOS. Sylvaneth and Daughters of Cain are armies led by women with core battle line troops that rely on female-coded models. Stormcast now have female warriors, and people were barely miffed when it happened. Sure, boob plate caused a minor stir, but mostly nobody cared. None of this sort of, but the women can't take the gene seed nonsense that you hear in 40k. All the elf factions and most of the Warcry warbands also have female models mixed in. It's not all better in AOS, though. AOS still doesn't have anything quite like Yenneed, a sort of positive, heroic force that echoes what Slaanesh is doing in some other ways, or is at least rejecting of gender stereotypes. Though to be fair, 40k doesn't really either. They made one model, then didn't promote it that well. It didn't sell great, and then GW never followed up. That doesn't fully count as representation. Right now, the Ynnari only exist so Reboot Guilliman can have sex with their queen. Ultramarines are garbage, and that plot is garbage. I digress. Really, if you want to solve Slaanesh, expand DOK. Broken Realms was a great step. Expand Sylvaneth. Why is Alariel always just a damsel in distress? And make an AOSified faction that communicates what Yenneed is trying to. Then you go to 40k, you make a mostly female faction that isn't Sisters of Battle, and then you expand the Ynnari. That's one route. You say done, fixed. Now Slaanesh can be evil, and you can execute the concept poorly, and the community can over-sexualize it for no reason, and the damage is still there, but it's controlled because there's other factions communicating the same thing without being the literal excuse for fascism. None of these fixes that I mentioned really get all the way there on their own, do they? But they offer a roadmap. You can imagine a good solution that takes a page from each one of these. It seems like GW is aware of the problem, at least. Introducing the Ynnari, however poorly, and starting AOS off with Slaanesh in jail, shows a hesitance to continue with the current status quo vis-a-vis Slaanesh. So how are they doing? What do the recent Slaanesh reveals really tell us about GW's plan for the god? So let's start with Sigvald. I actually really love this sculpt. I didn't like it at first, to be honest, but after a couple days and kind of mulling over what it was doing for the faction, it just grew on me incredibly well. It's dynamic, elegant, while at the same time just being hilariously macho. He doesn't look like anything in the Slaaneshi range, which I think is awesome because it expands the tent of what it means to be Slaanesh. He's also fully on the obsession side of the Slaanesh spectrum compared to hedonism, and I like to see them continuing to explore that dichotomy. Oh wait, did you say that there's a kit that does exactly that? Why yes, the Myrmidesh and Cymberesh dual kit is also a really cool addition, I think. The Myrmidesh hit a similar spot for me to Sigvald. They're armored head to toe, but still elegant. And I love this take on the Chaos Warrior. I could absolutely see a massed Myrmidesh force led by Sigvald and looking like sort of a dark fantastic mirror to the Stormcast. I'm really hoping there's some synergy there. On the other side, the Cymberesh remind me a lot of the Lord of Pain from a few months ago, trading a little bit of their armor, but keeping most of it in exchange for what seems like some BDSM stuff. You've heard plenty of folks meme on their derpy faces, so there's no need for me to. I do want to just say that I like the banner guy, and I like the whippy guy, but something about the other three doesn't quite work for me. Overall, I really just like that the kit explores the dual sides to Slaanesh worship. Even if the hedonism sculpts aren't for me, I can absolutely imagine someone else who'd be more interested in those than the Painbringers, and I think that's really cool. Then we have the Blissbarb Archers. And this is where it gets a little tough, right? Because I absolutely love these models. While they represent some of what, has been touchy for Slaanesh. Remember when I said the community adds sex where GW hasn't put it? Well, it's harder to say that here. The thing is, I think that their sexuality or, the fact that they have their breasts covered sort of just by accidental hair flips or these bangles, I think it's still in bounds for the game. Sure, they're in revealing outfits, but they've got dynamism, sweet spiky bows and armor, and they look like they're having a great time shooting people. You see these archers and you want to hang out with them, and that's how it should be. I do want to just point out, let's just mention the term Orientalism. It was created by Edward Said, just as a framework for talking about how portraying Near Eastern civilizations as other and inferior happens through European lenses. Now, I don't fully believe this, but you could sort of set up by saying, so if Slaanesh is constantly sexualized in the community and sometimes in the stories for being androgynous and having LGBTQ plus followers in high places, well, we fixed it. Now you're sexualizing them for being Middle Eastern. Now, I do think that's a little uncharitable in this case, because these are they're made to be awesome. Yes, this range borrows heavily from Frank Miller's problematic interpretation of the Persian Empire, but there's nothing here that says inferior the way Miller's 300 comic did. Though that does lead me to a side note of why are only the bad guys sexy in this game? It's just Daughters of Cain and Slaanesh, right? Do the bare breasts on Drycha, the one evil Sylvaneth, count? The message that the human body is itself a sin and only villains would show it isn't great, though maybe Fire Slayers count as a counterexample, as long as the muscle baby design doesn't ruin that for you. There's also the question of, is chaos even evil? Certainly a moot point if you decide that it isn't. I'm getting off topic here. The point is, I love the look of these archers. They're pretty badass, and the weird homunculus who hangs out with them is just hilarious. I do kind of wish they didn't stick out so much in the AOS range, but that's not going to stop me from picking up a box to paint for Warcry. So let's get to the Riders and then the Slangor. For the Slangor, first of all, we need someone to make an army of all these guys, using a Lumineth Mountain Cow as the base for a Keeper of Secrets conversion. I think that would be sweet. Otherwise, they're good monsters, Brent. The Slangors give a nod to the original Keeper sculpt, and the Seekers stay true to the ones that were still in use for the Demon Seekers. My only critique is that the Slangor have clearly been skipping leg day. Look at those huge claws and those skinny legs. They move 6 inches in Warcry, and honestly, I'm a bit skeptical. Then we have the two casters, Lord Glutos, the Lord of Gluttony, and the Shard Speaker. I'm not going to lie, Lord Glutos or Scallion, the Lord of Gluttony, doesn't really do it for me. I don't love the diorama models in general, whether Catacross, the Triumph of St. Catherine, or this. But I do love that Lord Glutos has a disapproving sword guy who gets to match Catacross's disapproving samurai man. He also continues the trend of GW exploring other aspects of excess. Gluttony should have been a part of Slaanesh's thing from the beginning, so the fact that it's taken them this long to create something exploring the concept is honestly a little surprising, but I think it's good. I sort of gave the Bliss Barbs a pass on the Orientalism question, but I do want to note that it's a little harder to do with Lord Glutos because he's specifically made to be repulsive. But the Shard Speaker is really cool and basically an extension of the Bliss Barb designs. I find the model a little generic compared to some of the foot casters they've come out with in their last few releases. That's okay, but compare this to, say, the Stone Mage or the Sonari Cathalar or any of the Ossiarch Bone Reaper casters. I just think those have a lot more flavor than this does. But the theme of forcing your enemies to gaze into a mirror is kind of cool, and it makes a nice addition to sort of a mixed Mortals and Demon army with the Contorted Epitome, which I think is really nice. If you love painting mirrors, I think that would be a cool army. Finally, let's get into the Newborn. The recent Morathi book introduced a new divine entity called the Newborn. As Morathi was eviscerating Slaanesh during her ascension ritual, a protean form escaped and streaked across the sky, gathering Slaaneshi followers by the hundreds of thousands and representing a new presence in the mortal realms. It gives you a lot to speculate on, right? So is Slaanesh just dead now, fully replaced by the Newborn, or is the god just going to stay in elf jail for a little while longer? Depending on what happens, this actually does take a few pages from different elements I listed in my Fixing Slaanesh section. Replacing Slaanesh with the Newborn kills Slaanesh a little bit. The Newborn is free to choose its own future, regardless of what Slaanesh has done in the past, and the new model range expands the Slaanesh tent, indicating that the threat is far greater than just gay panic that Dorian Dawes mentioned. Once they finally give it a shape and a name, I hope the Newborn acts independently from Slaanesh, as sort of its own being. The Yenneed storyline could also achieve this in 40k. Imagine if their attempt to kill Slaanesh, the Eldari manage it, but create something new in the process. That would free GW up to use the Slaanesh model range for other things in that universe, or maybe even let them give Fulgrim full control of it eventually, or at least the demon that possesses Fulgrim. 40k lore goes in twists. It's okay. Mostly just the point that they may have done this as sort of a dry run or a test to see how they could fix it in their bigger, more popular game. So how well does all this stuff fix the issue? We're going long here, so let's get into tying it all together. If the Slaanesh problem was that they presented an evil lust army that happened to also be their only LGBTQ+ faction, does it make it better if you add a whole bunch of sculpts to say, look, the army isn't solely LGBTQ+ anymore, there's more to excess than lust, too? The way they represent Slaanesh is different now. The demon range certainly didn't go anywhere, but this mortal release adds a ton to the faction. I think that's good progress. Diversifying the Slaanesh range and hinting at a new leader does put a roadmap together for fixing the faction over time, and they're exploring aspects of Slaanesh beyond what they've given us before. Sigvald and the Painbringers showcasing obsession, and Lord Glutos exploring a different side of hedonism. It's an incomplete fix, though. Having an androgynous prince-themed lineup of literal chaos demons is still problematic if we don't have other factions with LGBTQ+ representation or other things that defy gender stereotypes. Surprise, one release doesn't fix all the issues we've got, and that's okay. The new range and the new leader frees up GW to go in a new direction for Slaanesh with future stories and models. But that future really needs to do some heavy lifting. I doubt they're going to take Slaanesh out of chaos, but the new stuff does indicate that they're interested in re-exploring the kind of interesting philosophy that exists behind the god. They need to, and it seems like they're interested in deepening the motivation for Slaanesh's followers and really humanizing some of them here. Rather, at least hopefully, rather than falling back on some of the tropes that GW relied on in the past, in the 90s and early 2000s. This is again where the next few releases, years of releases, are going to matter. Will the game continue to get more diverse? Will Alariel ever have a story that isn't damsel in distress? Will they ever return to the Eldar Ynnari storyline to develop it in 40K? All of that kind of changes what this ends up looking like in the future. But also importantly, will we ever get a second source of LGBTQ+ representation in Age of Sigmar? I hope the answers to all those questions are all yes. I love the progress they made with Marathi's story, for example, this fall. Though I wouldn't mind seeing it continue since the last installment just left it at Marathi is so mean. We'll see where that goes. Also, these releases are brand new, so I don't want to harp on the point too much, but if GW continues too far down the track of the shining forces of order having design influences from European cultures, where the villains come from somewhere else, that would be unfortunate. For now, I don't think that that's a huge problem, and I do love that the Ossiarch Bone Reapers and the Mortal Hedonites of Slaanesh have some touches from ancient Asian cultures. Right now I think they diversify the game, and I think that's good. And I'm happy to table any future Orientalism discussions for the next couple years to see what GW does, but I wouldn't blame people for being sort of worried right now. Overall, I just think this army is really awesome. It makes me want to play it, and I'm glad the reaction I've seen online has been overwhelmingly positive. I'm not going to make an army of this faction, but I'm definitely going to pick up 2 boxes to do a Warcry warband. Then, with a demon and a mortal Warcry warband, I'll have a bunch of Slaanesh stuff, and oh god, the slippery slope into buying an army. Either way, the worst way they could have exacerbated the problems of Slaanesh is to make a new army nobody wants to play, and they definitely avoided that pitfall for sure, even if they still have more to do. Now, a lot of people might say that I'm overthinking this, but the thing is, this shit is important. Representation does matter. We live in a diverse world, and GW doesn't have an amazing track record with including a wide variety of people without insulting them. The sort of, now it's famous, a while ago when GW put out the Warhammer is for everyone post, but I think it was really great. Part of why I recorded this video, though, was I just want to make sure that they follow up. There's a reason my favorite hobby has a tendency to attract folks who take the wrong message. As GW has turned into Disney with chainswords, they've gravitated towards portraying their poster boys, the Space Marines on one side and the Stormcast on the other, as sort of the only good beacon holding back a tide of darkness. I hope they consider what that means for the way they portray every other faction. So there you have it. We went a little deep with this one, folks, but I think the conversation's interesting, and I'd love it if some other people want to keep it going in the comments. I'm going to be back in this channel with more Warcry content, looking at maybe some narrative stuff, and then also some tactical videos. We could see a Gloomspite Gitz takeover of the channel for a little while. Until then, may all your rolls be crits.